Welcome back. This is Kin 390. We are in Lecture 6, Energy Use During Exercise, and this is Part 2. Last time, or Part 1, reviewed the different energy systems, but then applied them to how or when they would predominate in certain physical activities or performances. And as I mentioned at the end of part one, that's a really important thing to understand as an exercise physiologist, because if you're going to ultimately design workouts and improve performance for individuals, then you have to know what the underlying, or you hopefully know, the underlying metabolic pathways for those activities. So I really hope that video activity, the YouTube activity, was helpful to you. And you can do those yourself. You can find videos that you'd like to watch, do the same activity, and then kind of evaluate it to decide what's the predominant energy system. There will be some questions like that on the exam. So if you have not yet watched that activity video, I highly recommend it. I think it'll really bring things together for you. Today, we're going to actually talk about the oxidative system. It's very complex, of course, and what we are going to talk about today is oxygen consumption, so the measurement of energy use with oxygen consumption, which is a very important concept in exercise physiology. We love oxygen in ex-phys. So just to kind of lay the foundation, I think it's pretty clear now. I feel like I've been talking, especially in a recorded lecture, you realize how many times you say things. So I think it's pretty clear that our ability to exercise or move or really do anything is dependent upon the production of ATP. And most of the time, the pathway used to supply energy for ATP production is dependent upon oxygen delivery. Most of our time, if you will, is spent in the oxidative system. Although certainly they aren't on-off switches, as I've said a couple times. What really we're doing most of the time is using oxidative metabolism. So therefore, we have to be able to deliver oxygen. We have to consume it. We have to use it. Because of that, then oxygen consumption and measuring that is a really important concept in exercise physiology. Because the amount of oxygen that you consume is directly related to the oxidative metabolic pathways, we can actually use the amount of oxygen that you consume to estimate your energy production. I know that doesn't seem right away a big connection or a logical connection, but it absolutely, if you see and understand that in that oxidative metabolic pathway, oxygen is required in the electron transport chain to accept the hydrogens, then you can obviously see if we're doing more of that pathway by doing more physical activity or more intense physical activity, then oxygen consumption is going to increase. So therefore, we can actually look at oxygen to estimate the amount of energy that we are producing. Because we've learned, of course, that glucose-free fatty acids absolutely require that. And when the oxygen binds to those hydrogens in the electron transport chain, results in a production of water. So by measuring the volume of oxygen, which we call VO2, and the volume of carbon dioxide, VCO2, so volume of oxygen is VO2, volume of carbon dioxide is VCO2. When we measure that, we can actually accurately estimate the amount of oxygen that the body uses. And the way we do that is through putting you on the metabolic cart. And I hope in Unit 1 you did a little background on equipment. So the metabolic cart, you're going to see a video here in a little bit, where you put a face mask on or a mouthpiece in and a nose plug, and everything you do, the amount of air that's going in and out is in a closed system, right? Because you have a face mask on. And when you do that, you can measure the amount of oxygen that someone consumes and the amount of CO2 that they blow off. So you can accurately estimate that because there's a difference between the inspired and expired O2 amounts. So we can tell how much O2 the tissue has consumed and used. Or we're inferring, really, right? So we're inferring that. So when we do that, when we hook you up to a metabolic cart, when we look at this respiratory gas exchange of the oxygen to the CO2, that is called indirect calorimetry. Indirect. Direct calorimetry exists, and what we would do for that is quite literally put somebody in a chamber that has some copper piping around it, and you can Google this, direct calorimetry. You can put someone in a chamber and see how much heat they produce. And of course, if they're producing heat and you've got some water around the chamber and some copper pipes, and you know that caloric measurement is how much water rises in temperature, then you can do direct calorimetry, right? Measurement of calories is calorimetry. So if you do respiratory gas exchange with the mask, oxygen and carbon dioxide, that's called indirect calorimetry because you're not directly measuring the heat that's coming off somebody that's raising water, but what you're doing is talking about how much oxygen they've consumed. Knowing how much oxygen they've consumed means that you can estimate how many calories that they've consumed as well. So here is a VO2 max test. I will play this for you in a second, but let me tell you what's going on. So a VO2 max test is a graded exercise test. What happens, graded exercise test means that every minute or every 2 minutes, there's stages. The intensity of that exercise goes up. What happens, and there's protocols in your ACSM guidelines that you can watch. But what happens is every minute that exercise gets more intense, you're going to be doing more oxidative metabolism. More oxidative metabolism means more oxygen consumption. Therefore, we would expect oxygen consumption to increase with every increasing stage, intensity stage. So if it's every 2 minutes, we're going to increase by 1 mile per hour, then oxygen consumption should go up. So you see here, let's see, where's my cursor? Here we go. So you see this guy that's doing the test. He's got that face mask on there. So everything that he's breathing in and out can only go through this face mask. He's obviously on a treadmill. And then we've got some tubing that looks like it's going around the back here. And then down here is the metabolic cart, which has a mixing chamber and some control gases. And then we have a screen. So really, like most technology, you have to know how to use the technology, but then once you have this screen putting out data and you know what you're looking at, it's real simple to do. So what happens for a VO2 max test is you increase intensity for every stage, and you pretty much tell that individual to just keep going. That doesn't sound very scientific, I know, but what happens is that they're going to push themselves, hopefully, to what we would call volitional exhaustion. So they say, I cannot go anymore. At that point, they're done, and then we look and see how high did their oxygen consumption get. Okay. Now, excuse me, we have obviously some criteria to see if they really reached VO2 max. So if someone really reaches VO2 max, what happens is that they will have a plateau in VO2 consumption despite increasing intensity. So even if, okay, let's just say theoretically they max out, or I'm sorry, they go from 9 miles per hour to 10 miles per hour. So that's an increase in intensity. But their VO2 consumption or their oxygen consumption was the same, let's say 60 mils per kg per minute. If those are the same, but we increase the intensity, that's a plateau in VO2. And when we see a plateau, that means that they probably reach true VO2 max, the maximal amount of oxygen that they can consume. Also, we look for a plateau in heart rate despite increasing intensity and a respiratory exchange ratio of over 1.15, which we will talk about here in a second. But RER is greater than or equal to 1.15. Okay, so let's watch this test to show you how we measure oxygen consumption and then max out.
Mask on. You ready? So good. Hold it there. Get it in position where you have a now. Tuck your cheeks in it too. Yeah. For those of you that want to know what we're all about, it's like this, y'all. This is 10% luck, 20% skill, 15% concentrated power of will, 5% pleasure, 50% pain, 100% reason to remember the name. He doesn't need his name up in lights, he just wants to be heard, whether it's the beat of the mic. I am so unlike everybody else alone, in spite of the fact that some people still think that they know him, but fuck him, he knows the code. It's not about the salary, it's all about reality and making some noise, making a story, making sure his click stays up. That means when he puts it down, time's picking it up. Who the hell is he anyway? He never really talks much, never concerned with status, but still even his starstruck. Humble through opportunities given despite the fact that many misjudge him because he makes a living from writing raps. Put it together himself, the picture connects, never rest by some.
What's his heart rate? 196. 196. Almost there. Nice work, Greg. Nice work. Doing great. Nice work, Greg. Keep it up. You're almost there. Good job, Greg.
Keep it up. Good job, Greg. Good job, Greg. Nice work, Greg.
Excellent job. Walk it just a little bit up.
He's not your everyday on the block. He knows how to roll with you. Got leg in his way to the top. He don't think it's a comment on his name. Asking him what's up. Even that brother doesn't stand for an actor. No, he's living proof. Let him rock in the booth. He'll get you buzzing quicker than a shot of vodka with juice. Him and his crew are no ram. It's one of the best. Dedicated to what they do and give 100%. Forget Mike. Nobody really knows how or why he works so hard. It seems like he's never got time because he writes every note, he writes every line, and I've seen him at work when that light goes on.
Well, there was some explicit language in that song. Apologies, Dr. Beckham. Anyways, you get the point here, is that this is a maximal test. And I believe the next slide, yes, this is the screen that they showed in the video. And although I can't read these perfectly and beautifully, I can figure out what they are because on our x-axis, that would have been intensity, so meaning, again, every minute or 2 minutes or whatever it was, they increased the intensity on him. And they did that, if you noticed, they did it by sure speed, but he actually wasn't going that fast. They actually increased the incline of the treadmill a lot. So, and that is a very typical thing to do on the treadmills to make it that high. He was like at 14%. So this blue line, these dots, the metabolic cart collects this data. You can set it up for different settings, but every 8 breaths is pretty typical. So that's it, every plotted VO2 data point there. And look at that. That's a plateau. That is very pretty. That is a true VO2 max plateau because I'm assuming that these blue lines are each stage. Okay, so every stage, oxygen consumption's going up as intensity's going up, and then we increased intensity and it didn't go anywhere. So he reached true VO2 max. The red is VCO2, and CO2 is still increasing, even at the end. And we're going to discuss why that is here in a second, but that would be expected. because you're going to start producing what we call non-metabolic CO2. So as when you do a lot of oxidative metabolism, you get water and CO2. CO2 is going to increase at pretty much the same pace as oxygen, but then when he starts to plateau out for oxygen consumption and CO2 still increases, we call that non-metabolic CO2. And that's because he's reaching such an intense level, he's producing a lot of lactate. When we buffer lactate in the blood, what happens is we get CO2 as a byproduct of that reaction. And that's one thing that you can do with lactate, is that you can buffer it in the blood. So not just take it to the liver or the heart, you can actually do a chemical reaction in the blood that we call buffering. It's called bicarbonate buffering. And when you bicarbonate buffer in the blood, that reaction yields CO2. So this is non-metabolic CO2. So this is very pretty data for a VO2 max test. And then you'll see down here, RER is over 1.15, which is, I told you, the third criteria. And then his heart rate data is not on here, but I would assume that if his VO2 is plateauing, that his heart rate max was also plateauing. So that's a VO2 max test, oxygen consumption. So through this indirect calorimetry, we can determine energy expenditure. So actually about for every liter of oxygen that you consume, you've expended 5 kcals. That is an estimate. Okay, so we can determine energy expenditure, but we can also determine substrate use, meaning, and we only look at glucose or free fatty acids. We only look at carbs and fat. We actually ignore protein. And the reason that we can actually look at substrate use when someone is hooked up to the metabolic cart and we're doing O2 and CO2 exchange is that it takes a different amount of oxygen to metabolize carbs and fats and proteins. But like I said, we ignore them. And if you remember me mentioning this, fats take more oxygen to be fully metabolized. So by measuring the VO2 taken in and comparing that to the VCO2 given off, we can actually determine which substrate was the major fuel source because of the difference. And because of that, we know that only certain pathways or certain systems can use these fuels. So we do something, we look at a measurement called the respiratory exchange ratio, RER. And the respiratory exchange ratio is a pretty simple math equation. It is VCO2 divided by VO2. And it's going to give you a ratio somewhere between 0.7 and over 1. So you can see here, and you don't have to memorize this completely. I'll tell you right now, though, here's the 3 numbers you should know. If you have an RER of 0.7, that means, if you go back to this equation, okay, if you have a smaller ratio, that means the number on the bottom of that equation is larger. So we know that if you have an RER of 0.7, that means that you're actually going to be pretty much using 100% fat to resynthesize ATP. We all understand, of course, it's never completely 100%, but we just say that for simplicity's sake, about 100% of your ATP is resynthesized from fat when the respiratory exchange ratio is 0.7. If you're in a respiratory exchange ratio of 1.0, it's exact opposite. So it just flips, and 100% of the resynthesis of ATP is going to come from carbohydrate. The only other number you should know is 0.85 because it's about 50-50. Otherwise, we all look this up too if we had to know the exact breakdown. And where do I come up with that estimation of kcals per liter? It's from right here. Because even though it is a little different, it's easier for me to remember, and most people to remember, that for every liter of oxygen you consume, you've expended 5 kcals, because this is what's going on if you're using fats and carbs. You're expending about 5 kcals for every liter of oxygen consumed. So here is a gradual increase, or this graph is showing you a gradual increase in the respiratory exchange ratio as intensity rises. Because what's going on, of course, O2 is rising, CO2 is rising, And then at 7.5, I'm assuming this is miles per hour. Oh, wait, this is cycling. Sorry. So with their speed, and this is oxygen consumption on the y-axis, oxygen consumption, or I'm sorry, this is mils per kg per minute, which is what we do for CO2 and oxygen. And then you see the green line is lactate. So this is a great graph because what it's showing you is just like that real data, O2 and CO2 are increasing at a pretty linear fashion, in a pretty linear fashion. O2 continues to increase as intensity increases, but once you start to produce more and more lactate, the CO2 really goes up, and that is due to the bicarbonate buffering in the blood, which is one of the fates of lactate. And then here's the picture that shows as intensity increases how that crosses over. And we actually call that the crossover concept. So at rest or at a very low intensity, most of your ATP is resynthesized from fat, whereas less is from carbs. But as you start to get more intense, and really this isn't all that intense, below 40% VO2 max isn't so intense. But by the time you're at full effort, 100%, you're using 100% carbohydrate and nothing coming from fat. And that's because you're moving so quick, you've got to be able to do the very quick or the quicker pathways. So as we increase exercise intensity and workload, which means, of course, how much you're doing, so that means more muscle contractions, we increase the demands for ATP production. I hope that is starting to all start to mesh now. So therefore, if we're going to need more ATP from oxidative metabolism, we need more O2. So to push more blood around, things like heart rate need to go up. Blood pressure goes up, and you'll discuss that in Unit 3. But then also breathing becomes deeper and more rapid because what we're trying to do is get more air in so we can take oxygen out. There is a limit to the amount of oxygen that can be delivered and used. Obviously, by even having something called VO2 max, that means that there's a maximal amount that we can do. And it varies from person to person. So it's the upper limit of oxygen delivery. It's also called other things. So maximal oxygen consumption, VO2 max, maximal oxygen uptake, maximal aerobic power. There's all sorts of things here for you to see, aerobic capacity. But when we see a number for somebody's VO2 max, that's a measure of a person's maximal capacity to generate ATP by aerobic means, by that oxidative system. Okay. At higher exercise intensities, of course, so once we get to the very end, anaerobic energy production predominates. So we have to switch over to anaerobic glycolysis and even a little bit of the phosphagen system, and that's why you see that increase in lactate once someone starts to get way up high in that intensity. So VO2 max itself is considered the best indicator of aerobic fitness. Although, as I mentioned back when we talked about lactate threshold is the better predictor of athletic success or performance because most endurance athletes have pretty high VO2 maxes. What they really want to be able to do is push the pace or the intensity for as long as possible. Now, VO2 max is highly dependent on many factors. Training, of course, is one of them. But there also appears to be a genetic limit to it. So you may have picked the right parents for endurance sport, and lucky you, I didn't pick those, but I tried. Anyways, so there is a limit to how much oxygen you can consume. Oxygen needs vary. Obviously, a larger person is going to consume more oxygen. So the best measurement that we do is we actually do relative. Units are milliliters per kg per minute because what it is it's looking at how many milliliters of oxygen you're consuming per kilo of body weight per minute. So that is a relative term, milliliters per kg per minute, and that's where most of the time you'll see that so that we can compare different body sizes. whereas the absolute term you may see is liters per minute. But milliliters per kg per minute for VO2 and VO2 max, I much prefer, because like I said, you can really look at people even if they're of different sizes, because you take into consideration their mass here. So let me tell you what's good, what's bad. You can look at your ACSM guidelines and see some tables that are going to put you in categories for whatever your VO2 max is. But I do have a couple memorized. So what's good? So for most of your age group, I imagine you're under 29. So under 29 years old, if you are a male, you have excellent cardiorespiratory fitness if your VO2 max is about 53 mils per kg per minute. Women under 29, you have excellent aerobic fitness if your VO2 max is around 49 mils per kg per minute. As you get older, those go down. And just to give you a kind of some context here, the highest recorded was a cross-country skier a handful of years ago. It was probably about 100 mils. I think it might have been 98 mils per kg per minute. The highest I've ever personally tested was a very good triathlete who was 78 mils per kg per minute. It was a male, a young male. The professional cyclist I used to work for, she was, I'd say in her late 30s or early 40s the last time I tested her, and hers was about 68 mils. So those are all really amazing readings, right? Very, very good elite athletes. So you're excellent if you're under 29 as a male at 53 and woman under 29 at 49. So those are all very, very good. Okay, so what, besides fitness and training, I was saying there might be a genetic limit, right? You may have picked the right parents. So if you recall back to Unit 1, our endurance fibers, slow twitch, type 1, these guys are real good at oxidative metabolism. They typically have more mitochondria, right? And that's where the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain occur. They have all the right stuff in terms of enzymes that aid in the breakdown of fats through beta oxidation. And no matter what, though, even if you didn't pick the right parents, I want to assure you that if you enjoy running, if you enjoy cycling, if you enjoy doing any other endurance activity, you can get better at it. You absolutely can train, and you can develop characteristics for these fibers. So it's not all hope is lost, but I do think you probably saw this in Unit 1 where you were looking at that percent slow twitch fiber composition, and that's on the left side there. Compare that to maximal oxygen uptake of the people, the average person in that group. You can clearly see that the individuals that have a higher amount of slow twitch or type 1 fibers, it pretty much equates to a higher VO2 max, right? So cross-country skiers and long-distance runners are kind of the people that we always use as examples for this. But even people like myself, I would consider myself a trained non-athlete, and I'm assuming you would consider yourself a trained student. The samples that they used for this study were pretty clear, right? The more slow twitch you have, the higher your VO2 max is going to be. Okay. Oh, look, there's a little quiz. So go ahead and take this little quiz for yourself. We'll stop here. Lactate accumulation is the balance between blank and blank. It represents a reliance on what energy system? What might the lactate threshold occur at a higher running velocity in more aerobically, or why might the lactate threshold occur at a higher running velocity in more aerobically trained athletes? And why might the LT occur at higher percent of VO2 max in more aerobically trained athletes? So I'll give you a minute here. I'm going to actually just stop talking, and you can reread this on your own. Okay, so let's talk about these. So lactate accumulation is the balance between, I would say, and these are Dr. Beckham's slides, but I think I can figure these out. It's between production and clearance. Okay, so how much you accumulate is a balance between how much you're producing and then how quickly you're clearing it. So it represents a reliance on what energy system? Lactate? Anaerobic glycolysis. Good job. Why might the lactate threshold occur at a higher running velocity in more aerobically trained athletes? And that's due to the fact that as you are more aerobically trained and you have adaptations that have occurred to the heart and the blood vessels, then you're going to be able to sustain a higher running velocity or higher running speed than someone who is not aerobically trained. And why might lactate threshold occur at a higher percent of VO2 max in more aerobically trained athletes? And that's because you clear this better, right? Like I said, you've made adaptations and you're also clearing the lactate better. Hopefully, you've also been training with some of those methods like intervals that are going to allow that lactate threshold to shift to the right. Okay, so let's talk about this here. We're almost done. So as we moved from rest to exercise, let me go back here. All right, so that's talking about VO2 max and doing a maximal test or a graded exercise test where you're increasing the intensity of someone's test every minute or 2 minutes or whatever. But that's not usually what happens in the real world, right? Usually if you're going to, and we're talking about aerobic or endurance events because we're talking about the oxidative system. I hope you're not feeling left out, you power lifters. But simply power lifters don't care too much about this because they're not doing a lot of oxygen consumption during their activities, maybe during training, but not during their competition. But anyways, most of the time what happens, let's say you're going to go out for a jog, you go out the door and you start jogging, and unless you're doing intervals or something like that, you probably, let's just use an easy example I can do math with in my head, you go out, you start jogging a 10-minute mile pace, and you do that for 30 minutes and you come home. That's more normal, right? So let's use that example. You go out the door, you start jogging at a 10-minute pace, and you do that for 30 minutes. So as you move from rest to exercise, or if you go to a higher intensity level, but we're not using that example right now, but still the same things apply here, your energy demands change. And I bet you would say that they increase. Therefore, oxygen requirements change. Yes, they increase. But what happens when work rates are held at a constant sub-maximal level? So a sub-maximal level means anything under max. So it's a wide range of intensities, but it's sub-max, and you hold it at a constant sub-maximal level, which would be going out and running at a 10-minute pace for 30 minutes. So you're keeping it the same. Oxygen consumption is not just going to keep going up and up and up and up like a VO2 max test, because in a VO2 max test, you're increasing the intensity every minute. When you're going out for an easy jog for 30 minutes, you're holding a constant sub-max workload. And then what's going to happen is that oxygen consumption is going to reach a plateau that we call steady state VO2. So this is what's happening with that example. If you go out the door, okay, so you're standing, you start jogging, okay, at that 10-minute mile pace. And this example is a 20-minute run. Great. What happens is oxygen consumption starts to rise because you need more oxygen to sustain this effort. But if you keep the same submax workload for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, more oxygen won't necessarily be required. You'll plateau out. You'll reach steady state VO2. So when you reach steady state VO2, that's a balance between energy requirements and AT production via aerobic metabolism. There's a balance. You've met your need. Okay? But you may have also noticed that on that curve, you don't jump automatically to that steady state. It takes a couple of minutes. But your energy requirements are increasing instantaneously because you have more muscle contractions. So you're going to rely a little bit more on anaerobic pathways. So that lag in oxygen consumption is what we call oxygen deficit. It's the difference between the oxygen requirements to meet the instantaneous increased energy demands and the actual oxygen consumption. So I'm just going to go right to a picture here because the oxygen deficit, I think, is much better seen on a graph. And there we go. So if you start exercising, resting O2 consumption, and by the way, resting O2 consumption is 3.5 mils per kg per minute. 3.5 mils per kg per minute for a typical person. That's an estimation, or considered kind of average. So you're always consuming oxygen if you're alive, by the way. I hope you know that. And you start exercise, and then the red is how much oxygen you're actually consuming. And it does take a couple of minutes, but you'll eventually reach that steady state. But you don't do it automatically. So you have more muscle contractions right away, so you need more, but you can't jump right to it. So you create what we call an oxygen deficit. It's a theoretical area. This is how much oxygen you would have consumed if you could jump right to what you needed. So O2 deficit is here. This is your O2 deficit. If you are a well-trained person, you will reach steady state sooner. So if you're an aerobically trained person, you'll reach steady state, maybe here instead. So the area under the curve here, or the area outside the curve, the O2 deficit will be smaller in a well-trained aerobic athlete. Another one, so this is actually, I should have just gone to this graph or to this slide. So we have our trained individual reaching steady state sooner, and so you can see that shaded in area. O2 deficit is smaller in a trained person, and that's because they're able to meet their oxygen demands quicker due to the adaptations that they've made as an endurance athlete. Whereas the untrained individual may take that full 4 minutes, or, we say 2 to 4 minutes about. But no matter what, and if it's easy enough activity, they'll reach steady state, steady rate, same thing. But then you stop exercise. Okay? You do your 30-minute jog, and you come back home and you stop. And then, of course, energy demands immediately decrease, but not completely. Oxygen consumption remains elevated for a while before returning to resting levels. You're continuing to breathe more deeply, more frequently. You may find that things like your heart rate is still up. So oxygen consumption after exercise is termed excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. So the elevated oxygen consumption after exercise is exactly what it is. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. So now here's the rest of this graph. So if we have someone going and jogging at 30 minutes, and they start their exercise and it's the same constant sub-max workload, they reach steady state. Yes, they created an O2 deficit, but then they stopped exercise. This area under the curve is how much oxygen they actually consumed. Okay, so this is theoretical. You didn't actually consume this oxygen. You had to have anaerobic metabolism help you out here for a couple minutes, just a little bit, but this is real. So this is how much oxygen you've consumed above baseline, above resting O2 consumption. This is how much oxygen you've consumed after exercise. Excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And you can see it can go on for a while, 10 minutes sometimes. So you do have some things going on after exercise that require more oxygen. Resynthesizing ATP, creatine phosphate, replenishing blood, muscle O2 stores. As I mentioned, you may be breathing still pretty hard. Your heart rate may be up. Your body temp is elevated. You've got to remove some lactate. You've got to take that lactate places, right, to get cleared. and you're going to have elevated hormone levels. So all of these things, coming back to baseline, require oxygen as well, because every cell requires oxygen, and if you're going to work, you're going to do more work, you need more oxygen. So this is all more work. This is another picture for you. If you like it, great. You know, I think the other ones do just perfectly good. Just fine, right? Just fine here. But what this actually is showing you, interval training and resistance training. So this is actually really kind of a new interest. This is a good graph, because what's going on here is you're seeing like 3 intervals, and then after each interval, you're not completely recovered, right? So then you go and you do your next interval, and then oxygen consumption's more elevated and you don't completely recover. And that's the point of interval training, right? Is that you recover a little bit, but you're still building a lot of stuff up. And then after this 3rd interval, you can see how long that epoch is lasting. So that's actually a really cool different graph or a visual. Okay, and finally, fatigue. Fatigue. So fatigue, as I told you in, I believe, part 1, is the inability to maintain force output. That can look a million different ways, but there's some reasons that we fatigue, and there's a lot of reasons we actually don't know about, because fatigue is very complicated, but essentially it means that you have to slow down or stop if we're talking about performance. Some people describe it as being tired in everyday life, and that's fine, but what we're talking about is having to slow down or stop. So we have metabolic causes for fatigue, and those are the ones that we'll talk about, because if you run out of fuel, then you're not going to be able to maintain force output. So you can run out of creatine phosphate, as we know, but this is really high intensity, and if you have very high intensity and you don't have a good rest period, this is why we have rest periods as well, then you will deplete that and you won't be able to do the same things as when you started. You can also run out of glycogen, and that's a real bad situation for endurance athletes, but this takes a while. As we talked about how much reserves you have quite a bit, a couple hours worth. So we're talking about activities continuously performed and definitely longer than 30 minutes. So if you run out of fuel, that's no good. You can also get those increases in hydrogen ions that accompany lactate accumulation. And I also mentioned this before. Those excessive hydrogen ions are going to impair cellular processes regarding energy production and muscle contraction. Okay? And you're going to get a lot of those hydrogen ions when you do really high intensity activity that creates a lot of lactate. So those real high intensity cycling or interval training, you're going to have to slow down or stop. Now, I also just want to briefly mention nervous system. There's definitely fatigue in the nervous system, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, but there's also psychological reasons, things like motivation and pain tolerance. And then Dr. Beckham has here this central governor in big question marks. If you want to look this up, it's great, or it's really a popular thing. So Mike Noakes is a very popular exercise physiologist in South Africa, and he believes there's something in the nervous system that he calls the central governor that essentially slows you down or makes you have to stop as a protective mechanism. It's like your body or your brain is saying, you're doing too much, you're going to hurt yourself, or you're going to kill us, or whatever, right? So it's saying, red line, red line, red line, you've got to slow down and stop. And that would be considered the central governor theory, the central governor theory. It's a really interesting one. A lot of people don't really believe in it. I tend to think that his data is interesting, but there probably needs to be more on it before this is real well accepted. So it's accepted by a lot of people. And like I said, a lot of his stuff is very convincing, but we don't really know. But maybe there is some kind of central governor that slows us down and stops us as a protective mechanism. So there's a study here that you can look at, and I would ask that you do that. I'm not going to read you the whole abstract, but please do look at that because Dr. Beckham really likes this one. And then, oh wait, sorry, is that it? Oh, okay. So that's it. That is it. So make sure, sorry, I thought there was one more slide. I apologize. So make sure you look at this study because, like I said, Dr. Beckham really likes it. And I know there was a lot of information today. I thought I could squeeze it in into one class period, and I think I did, time-wise. We're okay. But you may need to go back and listen to pieces or break this one up. That's okay. So please work at your own pace. Of course, you've got due dates, and you don't want to miss those due dates, but you can absolutely go back and just listen to this this part in parts, if you will, and make sure you do the readings with the textbook. You slow down. It's real hard. I'll be honest with you as we wrap up here. It's hard for me to not to get to see you. There's a lot of things I love about this unit that I would love to do in person and talk about in person, but we're doing our best. So please do try to get as much as you can out of this. It's actually a really nice lesson in learning how to learn independently or more independently. And I know that some of you struggle with that. I imagine I would struggle with that as well. So do a little bit every day. That would be my recommendation to you. Like I said, if this may end up being a 50-minute or an hour long video, do 20 minutes or wherever a logical stopping point is. Stop, think about it, write notes, go back, like in a book, go back and reread a sentence, go back and listen to something that you may feel is a little not as easy to understand, a little bit more complicated. But I do hope that you found this information interesting. I think it's fantastic. I am sad I'm having to deal with, I was very excited to get to work with you for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and everything has changed. But take care of yourselves, and make sure you say hi to me if you see me. And otherwise, good luck. But prepare well, do your readings, do your homeworks, do your term lists, and all those things, and you will be successful. Best wishes to you, and I will see you around.